Prologue. Before the sun rises in Aquilonia, find a soft chair near a window. Pull that favorite blanket up around your shoulders. Let the noise of your day slip out like steam from a kettle. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and a longer one out. Let us walk back, not just in time, but into another world entirely. Long before the great city stirs, before the shouts of vendors and the clatter of wooden carts fill the air, there lies a hush over Aquilonia. Aquilonia is not the marble Rome of emperors, not the polished coin you show to guests. It is the rough edge of the empire, a cracked heel, a forgotten street. It's where clay jars break, where pigeons fight over crusts, where morning doesn't come with a sunrise but with smoke. At this hour, the city smells of ashes and bread that hasn't risen yet. The cobblestones are still cold. The shadows are long and uneven. Chimneys puff thin threads of grey into a sky still unsure of its colour. In one of the narrow insula, those tall, creaking apartment blocks packed tighter than a soldier's pack, Marcellus shifts in his bed of straw. His blanket is scratchy, the colour of dry earth. He blinks at the cracked ceiling, listening to the soft drip from the corner. The room above leaks when it rains. It hasn't rained in 3 days, but the drip continues. Like memory, the bed frame groans as he rolls over. A pigeon perched on the windowsill startles, fluttering against the warped shutters before resettling with a stubborn coo. Marcellus mutters. Not even the birds sleep in this place. 3 stories below, the street is still and full of whispers. The stone beneath the balconies is chipped from decades of footsteps. Curtains flutter behind crooked windows. Wooden signs hang by fraying ropes, creaking even when the wind holds its breath. Across the alley, Aurelia is already up. She hasn't slept much. Sleep has become a stranger since her father's passing. She sits at her workbench, lit by a stub of wax, threading a dull needle through cloth so worn it sighs in her hands. A cup of yesterday's tea cools beside her. The room is quiet except for the soft pull of thread and the weight of thoughts she doesn't say aloud. She looks out her window at the sky, a pale slate, hinting at orange in the distance. Somewhere in the city, roosters call out of rhythm, and someone drops a clay bowl with a crash. Life is returning. In the stall-lined passageway beneath them, Lucius lifts the wooden flap of his soap stall. He's got hands that always smell like pine resin and sarcasm. He grumbles about his bad knee and worse customers. A cat rubs its side against his ankle. He shoos it with one hand, feeds it with the other. That's how things work here. Further down, Titus hoists a sloshing milk bucket over one shoulder. The bucket leaks. It always has. He's long since stopped trying to fix it. Instead, he walks faster, laughing when the milk splashes onto his worn tunic. Better the tunic than my toes. He jokes to the cobblestones. And across these moments, this shared silence, something else appears. A boy, no more than 10, leans against a crumbling wall. In one hand, a stub of chalk. With care, he scribbles a word no one will see until morning. Some days it's a proverb. Some days it's a name. Today it's only a symbol, a spiral, turning in on itself. No one knows the boy's name, but everyone has seen the chalk. Above it all, a faint trail of wood smoke snakes its way between rooftops. The smell is part pine, part hope. It settles into blankets, into bread dough, into bones. This part of Aquilonia does not wait for permission to wake. It yawns, it stretches, it hums in its own off-key rhythm. There are no kings here, no senators, just the ones who sweep the steps and carry the buckets. The ones who count coins and never keep them. The ones whose stories are never etched in marble but maybe in chalk. This is not a tale of glory. This is a tale of waking up, and you, dear listener, are invited, so pull the blanket tighter. Let the corners of your mouth soften. Let your eyelids grow heavy. We begin not with triumph, but with breadcrumbs, candlelight, and the aching beauty of trying. Come with us, before the sun rises in Aquilonia. Marcellus and the mattress that squeaked. By the time the first rooster decided to give up, Marcellus had already given in. His mattress, if it could still be called that, was less a bed and more a straw-filled relic of ancient discomfort. Every time he shifted his bony frame, the thing whined beneath him like a wounded lyre. It didn't squeak, it confessed. The wooden bed frame groaned in sympathy, and the pigeons in the rafters took offense. Marcellus blinked slowly. Above him, one pigeon, the The fat one he named Julius stared at him with imperial disdain. Sunlight leaked through the cracked shutters, carving pale lines across his uneven floorboards. The room was a rectangle of limits. A threadbare curtain, a chipped wash basin, one cracked mug, which held exactly half a morning's worth of barley tea when there was barley, which today there was not. He sat up, pulling the woolen blanket off his shoulders. It carried the faint scent of flour, charcoal, and mildew. His feet found the stone floor, still cool from the night, and curled instinctively. He flexed his toes. 10 still accounted for. Small victories, he mumbled. The wall groaned as someone on the floor below shifted. A baby cried through the floorboards. Somewhere above, a pot clattered, and someone swore. Aquilonia was waking. This was not the Rome of emperors and generals. This was not golden statues or gleaming temples. Aquilonia was the city's cracked heel. It was where walls bowed with age and bread lines bent around alleys. It was the part of the empire too real to draw. Marcellus grabbed his tunic from the wall peg. The fabric was stiff in places, marked by days of wear and heat. He slipped it on, adjusted the belt, and splashed water from the basin onto his face. It was bracing. He looked into the mirror, really just polished metal hammered into a curve. The boy looking back at him had olive skin, wind-rough cheeks, and eyes too tired for his age. He ran a hand through his thick hair and gave a half-hearted nod to the reflection. "Let's go feed Rome." He opened the door and stepped into the stairwell, ducking instinctively. The ceiling beam, always too low, had claimed many a morning bruise. The stairwell was dark and smelled faintly of wood smoke and old onions. The wooden planks beneath his feet groaned in protest with every step. He passed by the second floor, where a door stood open. Aurelia's shawl fluttered slightly from its hook. He heard the faint snip of thread, the soft rhythm of a needle against cloth. Outside, the alley stretched ahead of him, wrapped in early mist. The stone pathway was uneven, lined with moss between cracks. Laundry lines hung overhead, dripping dew onto the cobblestones below. Someone had thrown yesterday's grape stems into the gutter, and a stray cat was enthusiastically investigating them. Marcellus took a right past the butcher's closed shutters, then left down a lane flanked by stacked clay jars and crooked stools. He passed Lucius, the soap seller, who was just opening his stall. Lucius had a permanent squint and a collection of insults for every hour of the day. "Morning, doughboy," Lucius croaked, tossing a damp rag over a stool. Marcellus raised a hand in greeting. "Save me a bar that doesn't smell like regret." Lucius cackled. "I've got one that smells like envy and goat milk. Perfect for first dates." The scent of yeast and charcoal greeted him before the bakery came into view. A simple wooden sign hung above the door, scorched slightly at one edge from last year's fire. The door was swollen from humidity, so Marcellus pushed with his shoulder. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with flour dust and old firewood. The clay oven sat like a crouched beast in the corner, still warm from the night bake. The scent of sourdough and rye lingered in the walls. He hung his shawl on the hook, rolled up his sleeves, and checked the starter dough. It had risen unevenly, much like the city itself. The work began kneading, stretching, dusting, folding. His hands moved with tired precision. The dough was stubborn. The air was thick. The oven growled. He fed it kindling and waited. Outside, Aquilonia grew louder. The milk cart rumbled by. Children chased a runaway hat. The air filled with the chatter of early bargains and late regrets. The bakery bell jingled, a bit of bent tin hanging from twine. The door opened, letting in a stripe of gold. Aurelia stood there, shawl pulled close. "2 loaves," she said. "Still warm," he replied. Handing them over, she paused, looking at his flour-dusted face. "You always smell like comfort and chaos." He grinned. "That's the house blend." She left. He watched her go. The door closed. The oven cracked. Marcellus took a deep breath. It was morning in Aquilonia, and the world, as broken and beautiful as it was, had begun again. Aurelia's morning silence. Aurelia rose before the birds, not because she needed to, but because she did not sleep. Sleep had become too loud, filled with echoes of footsteps she could no longer chase, voices she no longer heard in waking life. So instead, She stitched. Her fingers moved as if pulled by something older than muscle memory. Each loop and knot was a prayer, unspoken and perhaps unanswered. Thread, needle, cloth, repeat. Her one-room home 2 floors below Marcellus was tidy in the way only necessity demands. The table doubled as her workbench, her cot tucked against the wall, draped in a quilt of hand-me-downs. A chipped mug held her needles. A small oil lamp, barely full, offered just enough light to see her hands. Outside, the morning fog had not yet lifted. The alley just beyond her window looked like a painting left unfinished. Roof lines blurred into the haze. The silhouettes of carts and early walkers drifted by like ghosts who hadn't been told they were gone. Aurelia's stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger was not new. Hunger had lived with her long enough to know when it was not welcome. She lifted a half-finished cloak, an order from a widow in the richer part of Aquilonia. The thread was silk, the kind she rarely touched. Expensive, smooth, it refused to behave. She pricked her finger. A small bead of red welled up. She sighed. Behave, she whispered to the cloak. Outside her door, the building stirred. Floorboards moaned. Marcellus had passed earlier. She recognized the rhythm of his steps. Too quick. Once slow, always slightly offbeat. They had exchanged glances on the stairwell yesterday. He had flour on his sleeve. She had said nothing. He had smiled. That was enough. She folded the cloak and wrapped it in cloth, then pulled her shawl tight, slid her coin purse into her sleeve, and stepped into the stairwell. The air smelled of must and wood ash. The hallway creaked as if announcing her exit. She walked past Lucius's stall. He was busy shouting about soap again. Something about smelling like lavender dreams instead of goat nightmares. She gave him a nod. He winked. That was their entire friendship. A boy ran past her, nearly colliding with her hip. She turned but said nothing. His laughter disappeared into the fog. The street opened like a waking eye. Shopkeepers pulled open shutters. Cloth sellers draped fabric over doors. A woman swept the same spot of stone she'd swept every day since Aurelia was a child. She reached the bakery and paused. The wooden sign swayed gently in the wind. A fresh scent bread. Smoke. Heat wrapped itself around her. Inside, Marcellus was dusted with flour. He looked up. 2 loaves. She nodded. He wrapped them in cloth, handed them over. You always show up before the first bell, he said. I like the quiet. She replied. Quiet's overrated. She didn't answer, but her eyes crinkled. Back outside, she turned not toward home, but toward the upper quarter, the cloak in her satchel pressed against her side. The widow's house was uphill, near the market where fruit cost twice as much, and the street dogs had cleaner fur. She climbed slowly. Her legs ached, but she did not stop. At the widow's gate, she knocked twice. A servant opened the door barely. One eye inspected her. Then the door creaked wider. Inside. The air was heavy with herbs and polished wood. The walls were lined with shelves holding things that had never been used. The widow sat by the hearth, back straight, hair pinned with silver. You're early, she said. I don't sleep well. Neither do I. Aurelia unfolded the cloak, held it up. The widow examined it carefully, ran a hand along the seams. Her fingers were thinner than Aurelia remembered. There's a button missing. Aurelia blinked. I checked them twice. Still, the widow said, it's not here. Aurelia bowed slightly. I'll replace it. The widow waved a hand. No need. I like things slightly broken. It feels more honest. That stayed with her as she walked back. On the way down, she paused by the chalk wall. Someone had drawn a spiral there. Fresh, still white. No signature. She stared at it a moment, then added a tiny X beside it. Maybe someone would notice. Maybe no one would. The fog had lifted by the time she returned home. The sun had finally pushed its way into the alley. She stepped inside, placed the bread on the table, poured a cup of water, sat down. The silence settled back around her like a second shawl. She reached for her needle and stitched quietly as the city roared back to life around her. The soap cellar of stall 7. Lucius had been selling soap in stall 7 for so long. The wood beneath his feet remembered his weight. The boards creaked different for him than for anyone else. Like they sighed, oh, him again. He wasn't old, exactly, But the lines around his eyes had long since set up camp, and his knees forecast the weather more accurately than any priest. He claimed to be 40, most guessed 50. No one argued. Each morning, just after the pigeons finished their council and the street kids finished chasing each other through puddles, Lucius would unlatch the front panel of his stall and let it fall open like a crooked jaw. Inside were rows of hand-cut soap bricks, arranged in crooked pyramids: pine, ash blossom, vinegar rose, tallow mint, and one he simply called Tuesday. No one asked what Tuesday was. It changed every week. He wore a brown tunic faded by years of heat and lie. His apron was dotted with waxy fingerprints, and the string of his ledger was tied 3 times over, because Lucius didn't believe in trusting ink. Soap's not glamorous. He liked to say, but neither is being the only one who doesn't smell like boiled cabbage. Children liked him. Adults tolerated him. Strangers underestimated him, which was fine. Lucius had never trusted charm. It got you invited to dinner but not remembered in a will. From his perch at stall 7, he saw everything, everyone. He watched Marcellus rush past every morning, cheeks flushed, breath visible. That boy always looked like he was running from or towards something. He watched Aurelia walk by, every step deliberate, like she was stitching the street together with her heels. And he noticed things: how the milkman tilted his bucket more on rainy days, how the chalk boy added punctuation only when it was sunny, how the bread vendor smiled less when the taxes went up. Lucius noticed. This morning, the fog hung low like wet laundry. He set out his wares slowly. A cartwheel creaked in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked at a shadow. His first customer of the day was a woman with red eyes and a sharp tongue. She needed something for her husband's feet and attitude. Lucius handed her a bar of vinegar rose. Won't fix him, but it'll remind you you can still smell nice. She didn't laugh, but she paid. Next came an older man looking for something to trade. He offered a belt with a cracked buckle. Lucius held it up, inspected it. You want soap for a belt that's seen more winters than my lungs? The man shrugged. It still holds. Lucius nodded and slid him half a bar. So does my patience. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted, and the alley filled with more life. The baker's scent curled through the air. The clang of tin on stone signaled a dropped cup. Arguments bloomed, resolved, and began again. Then, Titus arrived. Lucius. The milkman grunted, setting down his half-empty pail. Smell me. Quick! What do I reek of? Lucius leaned in, sniffed, winced. Ambition, with a hint of disaster. Titus wiped his forehead. Worse than yesterday. You're trending downward. Titus sighed. Give me the pine one, and something for the cart. Lucius handed him 2 bars. Tell the cart I said hi. He watched Titus lumber away, leaving a trail of sloshing milk and mild despair. Then came the chalk boy, quiet as smoke, hands grey from dust, eyes too large for his face. He didn't speak. He never did. Lucius offered him a broken sliver of soap. The boy took it, nodded once, and vanished back into the maze of alleyways. Lucius leaned back on his stool, closed his eyes for a moment. Soap didn't solve anything, but it helped. Later, as shadows grew long and the air thickened with the promise of supper, Lucius watched the widow from the upper quarter walk past. She carried a new cloak, button missing. He smiled to himself. Nothing in Aquilonia was ever quite complete. And that, Lucius thought, was the point. Titus and the milk that never arrives cold. Every morning before the city truly woke, Titus was already sweating. It wasn't the kind of sweat that came from labor alone. It was the kind that rose from knowing your best effort would still fall short. Because in Aquilonia, milk never arrived cold. Titus was not a tall man, but he was wide in the way that made door frames nervous. His shoulders had carried buckets since he was 10. Back then, the pails were smaller. So was his hope. Now, he walked the same path every day, up from the stable yard, past the bakery, down through the market sliver, left at the chalk wall, right at the temple steps. 7 stops, 2 buckets, 4 sloshes per turn, always warm before the 3rd. This morning, the mist clung to his tunic like guilt. The air tasted like wet stone and tired bread. Why, he muttered to the bucket, must you betray me so early? The bucket, predictably, offered no reply. Titus tugged his cap lower. It was a gift from his mother, a woman who believed in warm milk and hard truths. He missed her most on the long mornings, when the road felt like it was growing longer beneath his feet. At the bakery, Marcellus had already burned the first loaf. "You're early," Titus said, leaning against the doorway. "You're dripping." Marcellus replied, "It's not sweat, it's ambition." "Right, looks a lot like regret." They grinned, exchanged a quick nod, and parted without need for more. Some friendships grew in words, others were baked daily in silence. Next stop, the apothecary shop closed. Again, Titus knocked. Mostly for tradition, no answer. He shook his head and moved on. As he passed Lucius' soap stall, he slowed. Lucius was counting coins, or pretending to. "Smell me," Titus demanded. Lucius leaned in, grimaced. "You smell like you insulted a goat and the goat retaliated. I'll take the pine one again." Lucius handed him a bar, along with a broken sliver. "For the cart," he added. The cart his partner in failure waited by the fountain. Its wheels squeaked with a rhythm Titus found both familiar and annoying. He swore the thing resented him. As he hoisted the bucket back into place, a child darted out from an alley, slipping in behind him. "You forgot this," the boy said, handing over a linen wrap he hadn't realized was missing. "Thanks," Titus muttered, startled. "You, want some milk?" The boy blinked, shook his head, vanished. Strange kid. By the time he reached the priest's house, the milk was warm. As always, the priest opened the door with a frown, received the pail, and closed it without a word. Titus sighed. "Bless you too, Father." At the corner, he paused by the chalk wall. A new spiral. Next to it, a tiny X. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like someone else was watching and caring as he walked back toward the yard. He passed Aurelia, her arms full of folded cloth. He tipped his cap. She gave him a look half respect, half amusement. "You're leaking," she said. "Like always," he replied. That afternoon, the sky turned amber. Titus sat behind the stable, feet up on a stone block, bucket beside him. Not empty, not full, just tired. He watched the street buzz Marcellus talking to an old woman, Lucius arguing with a cat, Aurelia pausing by the lantern maker's bench. He wondered, not for the first time, if anyone noticed how hard it was to carry something fragile through a world that didn't want to stay cool. Then he chuckled. "I'm talking about milk," he told himself. Just milk. Still, he knew it wasn't really about the milk. It was about carrying the same weight every day, knowing it would warm in your hands before you ever reached where it needed to go, and doing it anyway. The chalk scribbler by the wall. He was small enough to be overlooked, and quiet enough to stay that way. No one knew his real name. Some called him Mouse. Others didn't call him anything at all. But almost everyone, at some point, had noticed the chalk. It appeared overnight lines, spirals, half sentences scratched into the crumbling side of the old eastern wall, white marks on soot-stained stone. Sometimes a quote, sometimes a question. Once, just the word still. He used no colour, no fancy script, just a stub of broken chalk wrapped in cloth, kept in a pocket beside a dried fig. He lived where no one looked, a collapsed cellar near the bathhouse ruins. The bricks bowed inward. The roof was canvas. He shared it with 3 rats and a bird who came only for crumbs. His days were spent watching, from rooftops, from crates, from beneath market stalls. He watched Marcellus run late, every day, and talk to pigeons like they owed him rent. He watched Aurelia walk in straight lines, even when the road bent. He watched Lucius sell soap with jokes too clever for half his buyers. And Titus, who cursed his buckets but always smiled at dogs. The boy listened, memorized, and rewrote the city in chalk. This morning, he'd chosen the wall near the fountain. He crouched low, one eye on the alley mouth, the other scanning yesterday's scribbles. Most had faded. One had been smudged by a child's dirty palm. He started fresh. "Be kind, for we all carry things you cannot see." He paused, underlined all, drew a spiral, then added a tiny X like Aurelia had done the day before. It wasn't a signature, just a nod. He stood, stretched. His knees popped like stones in a jar. Down the street, Lucius was already open, arguing with a woman about mouldy lavender. Marcellus tossed bread crusts to birds, one of whom might have been named Julius. Titus wiped his brow, leaving a white smear of milk and chalk. None of them saw him. Not really. And that was fine. He wandered past the weaver's store, ducked behind the wine cart, and slipped into the back lane near the temple. A child dropped an apple. He picked it up, handed it back. The child stared at him like he was a ghost. He kept moving. Back near the bakery, he leaned against a post and listened. Marcellus spoke to himself while kneading dough. "Rise better this time," he mumbled. "Or I'm feeding you to the pigeons." The boy smiled. He liked that line. On the opposite wall, he found a blank patch and etched, "Even bread has bad days." He chuckled, nearly silently. Later, he saw Aurelia walking toward the quarter gates, cloak tucked under one arm, her brow furrowed. Her steps quick. He didn't follow, but he watched until she vanished past the market stalls. Then he walked the longer way home past the lantern maker's courtyard. The old man was asleep, hands folded, a clay lantern still glowing faintly beside him. The boy approached carefully, not wanting to disturb the breath of peace around the scene. Next to the lantern, he drew. Light remembers. When the old man stirred, he didn't wake, but his fingers brushed the chalk without knowing. The boy slipped away. Back at the cellar, he placed his chalk back in its cloth, tore off a piece of bread from his stash, fed the bird, named it Maybe. He sat with his knees tucked under his chin, watching the light shift through the broken slats above. Tomorrow, he'd write something else, maybe about the boy with tired eyes and fire-stained hands, or the girl who stitched silence into every seam, or the man who smelled like pine and wit. Maybe all of them, because someone should write it down, even if no one knew who, even if the rain would wash it away, even if it was only chalk on a wall in Aquilonia. The baker's broken oven. Marcellus knew something was wrong the moment he touched the oven door. Not the usual warm hum, not the soft glow behind the iron grate, just stillness. Cold. He pulled back his sleeve and touched the clay side again. Still nothing. "No, no, no," he whispered. Not today. The oven had gone cold overnight. It wasn't the first time, but it was the worst time. Outside, the market square buzzed louder than usual. It was festival eve, the kind of day when neighbours doubled their bread orders and travellers paid extra for loaves that smelled like home. Every coin counted today, and the oven, his partner in feeding half the alley, had decided to die. Marcellus crouched, pulled open the flue, poked around the ash, tapped the outer shell with a stick like it might change its mind. Nothing. Footsteps thumped outside the bakery, then a thud against the door. "Open up, bread boy," came Lucius's familiar rasp. Marcellus cracked the door. Lucia stood there, arms full of wrapped soaps and sarcasm. "You look like someone just stole your yeast. The oven's cold." Lucius peeked in, then whistled. "She's quieter than a priest at a tax audit." "Don't joke." Marcellus groaned. "It's festival eve. I've got 3 dozen orders, and half the city will come hunting if they don't get their loaves." Lucius stepped inside, rubbing his chin. "Could be the flue's clogged, or she's just tired of your constant nagging." "Seriously?" Lucius patted his back. "You need Sabina's kindling. That woman can start fire on wet marble. She charges double on festival days." Smile wide. Play desperate. Maybe she'll take pity. Marcellus sighed and grabbed his coin pouch. He had 4 coppers and a bent button. Outside, the air buzzed with clamour. Children in painted masks darted between fruit stalls. Vendors argued over plum prices. Musicians tuned lyres off-key. Sabina's cart sat near the temple steps, stacked high with chopped pine and cedar. "You're late," she said. Before he spoke, "My oven quit. I need the driest you've got." She crossed her arms. 5 coppers. I have 4, and a very charming button." She took the pouch, peered inside, then held up the button. It glinted dull bronze. "Whose coat did you rob?" "My father's." "He'd understand." She chuckled. "Fine, but you owe me a sweet roll after sunset." "Deal." Back at the bakery, Aurelia stood just inside the door, her shawl wrapped tightly. "Word spreads fast," she said. "What word?" "That you're wrestling an oven instead of baking." "It's recovering." She stepped closer, eyeing the cold hearth. "Need a hand? Fire." I know patience. Together, they restacked the kindling, layering it with dry straw and torn linen. Marcellus struck flint. Nothing. Again, spark, smoke. Aurelia blew gently. The spark caught. The straw curled and hissed. The flames danced upward like they were trying to remember how. He fed it slowly, hand steady. Minutes passed, then warmth, soft at first, then steady. Marcellus leaned back on his heels. Your good luck. Just persistent, she replied. He offered her the first roll of dough. Want to shape it? She hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers moved with care, pressing, folding, smoothing edges. They worked side by side, silent, but for the rustle of flour and the occasional creak of the rising heat. Lucius reappeared an hour later with a grin and a wrapped package. I brought you festival soap, he said. Smells like ambition and regret. I'll take both, Marcellus said. The first loaf came out lopsided, too pale on one side, but the crust crackled, and the smell made Aurelia sigh. By midday, the counter held a row of warm, imperfect, heartfelt bread. Shoppers trickled in, coins clinked, smiles exchanged. Even the priest stopped by, took 2 loaves, and whispered, "Bless the fire." Marcellus caught his breath between customers. Behind him, on the back wall, a chalk line had appeared, a spiral, and next to it, 3 words, "Warm is enough." He looked out the window. The boy in the alley grinned, then vanished. Marcellus smiled, brushing flour from his cheek. The oven glowed, and for the first time that week, so did he. Aurelia and the missing button. The button was missing. Aurelia stared at the cloak folded neatly across her lap. It was a soft charcoal grey, stitched from imported wool and lined with silk commissioned by one of the wealthiest widows in the upper quarter. Everything about the garment was perfect, except that one small, stubborn button. She checked again, turned the cloak over, ran her fingers along the seam, searched the floor near her stool. Nothing. It wasn't just a button. It was her reputation. And for a seamstress in Aquilonia, reputation was currency. She let out a breath, slow and steady, then reached into her sewing box. She had other buttons, wooden ones, bronze ones, even a carved bone, one shaped like a laurel but none matched. The missing one was obsidian black with a ridged edge. Imported, rare. The widow had given her the full set herself. A knock on the door startled her. It was Marcellus, holding a warm cloth bundle. "Festival sweet roll," he said, grinning. "A deal's a deal." She smiled despite herself. "You remembered." "I remembered debts, and kindling, and who helps me resuscitate dying ovens." He stepped inside, glancing around. "You look like you lost a duel." "I lost a button." "Ugh." He set the bundle on the table. "Grave matter. I've looked everywhere, and I can't replace it with something lesser. The widow has eyes sharper than my needles." Marcellus scratched his jaw. "Have you tried bribery or denial?" "I tried not crying. That's as far as I got." "Want help?" She paused, then nodded. They searched together beneath the rug, behind the curtain, under the cot. Marcellus even checked the bread roll. "No treasure inside," he said, brushing crumbs from his fingers. "Maybe it rolled outside," Aurelia muttered. Stepping into the hall, they passed old Marcus, who was halfway through yelling at a stairboard that creaked differently than yesterday. "You seen a shiny black button?" Marcellus asked him. Marcus squinted. "What's in it for me?" "Peace and quiet." The old man waved them off. On the street, the air was thick with garlands and tambourines. Festival banners fluttered from window ledges. Kids ran barefoot with faces painted in red spirals. They made their way to Lucius's stall. "Seen any rogue buttons?" Marcellus asked. Lucius blinked. "You asking me for fashion advice now? It's for Aurelia." Lucius's eyes softened. "Ah, that's different." "No, but I did sweep one into the gutter this morning. Could be yours." "Where?" Lucius pointed to the edge of the market, where the stone path dipped into a narrow drainage channel. Trash and flower petals floated lazily. Aurelia knelt, scanning the shallow water, and there, gleaming under a leaf, was the button. She let out a sound, part relief, part disbelief, and reached in. Water soaked her sleeve. The button slipped once, then twice, but finally landed in her palm. Marcellus offered his sleeve to dry her hand. Victory. Salvaged, she said. Not perfect. Sounds like the city. Back at her apartment, she stitched the button back onto the cloak with practiced care. The thread moved like memory tight. Steady. Forgiving. Marcellus waited quietly, sipping tea from her cracked cup. When she finished, she held up the cloak. Would you walk me to the widow's? He rose. Only if I get another sweet roll. Greedy, motivated. They walked through the upper quarter together. The streets narrowed, but the houses grew wider. Marble statues guarded doorways. The air smelled like rose oil and rules. At the widow's gate, Aurelia hesitated. She once told me her furniture doesn't creak, she whispered. Monstrous, Marcellus replied. A servant opened the door. They stepped into silence and polish. The widow sat by a golden brazier. Hands folded, Aurelia bowed. I brought the finished cloak. The widow examined it, fingered the buttons. Her eyebrows rose. Aurelia braced herself. But the widow simply said, This one feels heavier, like it survived something. Aurelia blinked. It might have. The widow gave the faintest smile. Then so have you. They left with coin in Aurelia's hand and something warmer in her chest. On the walk back, Marcellus said, That was more poetic than I expected. She's not unkind, just rarely practiced. Like my baking. Aurelia laughed. They paused by the chalk wall. A new line had appeared. Some things go missing to be found. Aurelia stared, then added her own chalk mark beside it. A curved line, like a half-stitched thread. Marcellus watched her hand move, then whispered, Maybe the city's not stitched with stone. Maybe it's held together by people who notice buttons. She looked at him, and for a moment, Aquilonia didn't feel like a city full of noise and worry. It felt like home. Lucius and the letter that wasn't meant to be read. Lucius didn't believe in letters. He believed in spoken words, in squints and smirks, in the knowing nod exchanged at the right time. But ink on parchment, that was for people who had the luxury of distance. He lived close to his stall, close to the fire pit where he warmed his knees, close to people's soapless secrets. And yet, here it was. A letter, folded twice, sealed with wax. No name. It had been slipped under the crate behind stall 7. He found it while chasing a runaway soap sliver that had escaped its wrapper like it had somewhere better to be. He'd meant to toss it, but then he saw the wax seal imprinted with a spiral. A small one, familiar. He turned the letter over in his hand 3 times, debated, shrugged, then stuck it inside his coat. By midday, curiosity gnawed louder than his conscience. He waited until the stall quieted. After Titus left with a pine bar and a scowl. After the chalk boy had wandered by without making eye contact. After Marcellus had waved from across the street with flour on his nose. Lucius slipped into the alley beside the old coin press, where light rarely reached and even fewer questions followed. He broke the seal. Inside, the letter was written in a careful hand slightly crooked, as if the writer had only recently mastered lines. To whoever finds this, if you see me, you probably don't know me. That's fine. I notice you. I watch everything. This city is loud. But some parts are quiet, like the way Aurelia folds cloth with both hands even when she's tired. Or how Marcellus hums when he thinks no one's listening. Or how you always give the broken soap pieces to the kids without asking. You probably don't think anyone sees that. But I do. I'm trying to write down what matters before it disappears. Lucius stared at the page. His thumb traced the ink. No name, no return, just words. He leaned against the wall and chuckled. Well, I'll be... That afternoon, he was quieter than usual. He didn't insult anyone's mother-in-law, didn't joke about lavender nightmares, didn't peddle the soap that hides your shame. He watched instead, watched Marcellus wrestle dough that didn't want to rise, watched Titus drop a coin and pretend he meant to, watched Aurelia pass by, a scarf loose around her neck, her eyes scanning rooftops. Lucius tucked the letter into his ledger, between 2 soap recipes and a list of customers who still owed him. Later that day, Marcellus dropped by, holding a small packet wrapped in wax cloth. I baked you something weird, he said. Accidentally used spice meant for wine. Smells like winter and regret. Lucius sniffed it. Regret's underappreciated. He bit into it, winced, swallowed. Delicious. He lied. Marcellus grinned. You're off today, Lucius shrugged. Just taking notes. For what? Posterity. That evening, as the stalls closed and firelight began licking windowsills, Aurelia arrived with a bundle of newly stitched cloth. Thought you might want something less patched, she said. Holding out a scarf, Lucius unfolded it. It was simple. Soft, dyed a gentle blue. One edge had a faint spiral embroidered at the corner. He met her gaze. This yours? She nodded. Someone's been watching. Someone always is. He tucked the scarf into his coat pocket. Beside the letter, as Aurelia turned to leave, he called after her. Do you believe in letters? She paused. Only when they say what we're too afraid to. He nodded, and after she disappeared around the corner, Lucius stepped out, walked to the chalk wall, and added a line of his own beneath the spiral. Sometimes we're seen more clearly in silence. That night, he didn't light a lantern. He sat by the edge of his bedroll, with the scarf draped across his lap, and the letter resting in his hand. And for the first time in many years, Lucius didn't feel like a man people pass by. He felt written. Titus and the goat that ate the festival banner. Titus had never liked goats. They were stubborn, blood, smelled worse than a fishmonger in summer, and yet, somehow, the city's festival committee had decided this year's celebration would include a parade of goats dressed in floral garlands. Tradition. They called it ridiculous, Titus muttered, as he dragged his cart through the square and saw the first goat chewing its way through a pile of carnations. He stopped just in time to avoid trampling a child chasing a painted hoop. The cart wheels squeaked, the milk sloshed, and the goat, because of course, locked eyes with him. It was a broad-shouldered thing with one ear bent like it had heard too much in life. A wreath of half-eaten daisies hung from its neck. It looked more philosopher than livestock, and it had something in its mouth. Something red. Titus squinted. Is that a banner? The goat blinked slowly and continued chewing. Indeed, the long strip of bright crimson linen with gold lettering now hung half-swallowed from its jaws. By all the broken gods, Titus groaned. That's the mayor's banner, the goat chewed, unaffected. Titus set down the bucket, approached cautiously. Okay, you four-legged menace, he said, extending a hand. Let's not make this a... The goat bolted, right through the square, past Lucius's soap stall, where 2 bricks tumbled as the creature brushed the edge, through a cluster of dancers practicing a step they would soon forget, past Aurelia, who had to sidestep gracefully to avoid being clipped by hooves. Titus ran after it, shouting apologies, curses, and surprisingly polite warnings. Move. Goat. Dangerous goat. Official banner thief. Marcellus, hearing the commotion, stuck his head out the bakery window, a loaf in one hand. Did you lose a customer or a moral battle? He shouted. Both, Titus called back. Aurelia, having recovered from the near collision, fell into step beside him. Want help or a running commentary? Help. Definitely help. The goat weaved into a fruit stall, knocking over 2 baskets of pears and a jar of plum jelly. The vendor screamed, shaking a ladle at the sky. They cornered the animal near the temple steps, where it finally stopped to inspect a stone basin filled with holy water. Titus approached from the left, Aurelia from the right. Easy, she said softly. You've had a big day, the goat snorted. Then, with shocking speed, it lunged not at them, but toward the nearest lantern. The fabric hanging above the festival gate rippled in the wind. Tempting fate. Don't you dare, Titus hissed. Too late. The goat jumped, ripped down the edge of the lantern string and sent half the decorations tumbling in a shower of coloured ribbons. The crowd gasped, then laughed. Children clapped. Musicians changed their tune, and somehow because the city loved a story, the goat became the unofficial mascot of Festival Day. The mayor, upon hearing of the incident, simply sighed and said, "Put a medal on it." By sunset, the goat had a named senator and a new garland, and Titus had become a local legend. Lucius crafted a special bar of soap that smelled like goat, panic, and redemption. Marcellus offered a loaf shaped vaguely like hooves. Aurelia embroidered a tiny goat silhouette on the hem of Titus's scarf as a surprise. Titus sat by the fountain, still out of breath, watching the city swirl in laughter and lights. Senator the goat sat beside him, chewing calmly on a turnip someone had tossed from a cart. "You caused chaos," Titus muttered. The goat looked proud. "You ruined a banner, almost cost me my job." A pause. "But you were kind of magnificent." The goat blinked. From across the square, the chalk boy stood near the wall, grinning. He wrote, "Some heroes chew things." Titus chuckled, then stood, brushed off his knees, and offered the goat a pat on the head. "You're still a menace," he said, "but you're our menace now." And for the rest of that evening, in the warm hush of festival lights and the scent of roasted figs, Titus walked beside a goat draped in ribbons, and Aquilonia cracked, loud and unpredictable, laughed with him. Aurelia and the cloak that wasn't hers. The cloak was heavier than she remembered. Aurelia held it up, frowning, the stitching along the hem too fine. The buttons all there, but brass instead of obsidian. The lining lined with thread of gold, definitely not hers. She laid it flat across her work table and stepped back. "I didn't make this," she whispered. Yet it had been delivered to her doorstep in the early morning, folded neatly, with no note, outside. The remnants of the festival still clung to the alley, ribbons caught in gutters, the scent of roast chestnuts in the air, children's chalk drawings smudged into smiling ghosts. She tugged on her shawl and went to Lucius's stall. He was sipping something steaming from a chipped mug. "You ever see who dropped a cloak off at my place?" she asked. Lucius squinted. "Brown one, brass buttons. Looked like it belonged to a senator's mistress." "That's the one." "Yeah, I saw a boy drop it and run. Not one of the usual street kids. Had clean boots." "Which direction?" He pointed toward the upper quarter. "Where the buildings have opinions." Aurelia sighed. "Figures." Lucius leaned on his elbows. "Maybe it's a mistake. Or maybe someone thinks you're colder than you let on." She smirked. "If they wanted to help, they'd have dropped off coin." Still, something about the cloak unsettled her. She turned to go and nearly collided with Marcellus. "Whoa," he said, steadying her. "You storming the palace?" "Not yet," she replied. "You free?" "I can be." They walked together, up past the chalk wall where someone had written, "Not everything left behind is forgotten." Up into the quarter where cobblestones were swept twice daily and windows had lace curtains. The houses here weren't homes. They were monuments. At a curved blue door with polished brass knockers, Aurelia hesitated. "What if it's a gift?" Marcellus tilted his head. "Then we say thank you, or return it, or burn it in protest." She knocked. A servant answered, eyed them both. Narrowly, "We're not selling anything." Marcellus offered helpfully. "We're returning something," Aurelia added. Holding out the cloak, the servant blinked. Then, without a word, stepped aside. Inside, a woman sat by the hearth, older. Regal, a scar across one cheek that had been softened by time but not forgotten. Aurelia's breath caught. "Lady Corvina," she said. This is your cloak." The woman rose slowly. "It was, why send it to me? I didn't," Corvina replied. "My son must have." Aurelia looked confused. "I don't know your son." Corvina walked to the cloak, traced a finger along the lining. "He was at your store once. Said you reminded him of someone brave." "I don't understand." Corvina smiled faintly. "He died last spring. Battle at the border. I hadn't touched this cloak since. But he left a note with it. Said it should belong to someone who keeps going even when the world forgets to be fair." Silence. The fire crackled. The room shrank to that one breath. Aurelia opened her mouth, closed it again. Then finally, I don't know what to say." Corvina stepped forward. "You say thank you. You wear it when it's cold. And when you don't feel brave." Marcellus reached out, touched Aurelia's sleeve. "We should go." They left quietly. The sky outside had shifted to grey. Rain coming. Maybe. At the alley corner, Aurelia stopped. She turned to Marcellus. "What do you do when someone gives you something you don't feel worthy of?" He smiled. "You grow into it." That evening, she wore the cloak as she stitched by the window. It hung differently, made her sit straighter, and when the wind whistled through the shutters, she felt not warmer, exactly, but seen. A soft knock came at her door. She opened it. Lucius stood there, holding a bar of soap shaped like a leaf. Festival leftovers, he said. She took it. You think I need to smell like a garden? I think you need to know you're not alone. Before she could reply, he added, Also, you probably do need to smell like a garden. You've been sewing all day. She laughed. Fair. When he left, she set the soap on her workbench, then added a new mark to the chalk wall outside her own spiral, slightly open at one end. The wind tugged at her cloak as she stepped back inside, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like just a seamstress. She felt like a story someone had dared to pass forward. The chalk boy and the lost drawing. He didn't panic when he realized the chalk was gone. Not at first. He just reached into the small cloth pouch he always tied to his hip, same as every day, and instead of chalk, his fingers brushed an old fig stem and a pebble shaped like a tooth. He paused, checked again. No chalk. He checked his secret hiding spots. Under the third stone behind the temple, in the hollow post by the bakery, beneath the broken tile behind the bathhouse, all empty. Now, the panic came, not loud, but quiet, like the moment before rain. He wandered toward the old wall, where he always wrote its surface still grey from the morning fog, waiting for lines that weren't coming. He touched the wall, rough, cool, familiar, a place where silence could be shaped. But today, his hands were mute, so he walked down past the bakery where Marcellus had just burned the edge of a sweet roll. The baker waved a hot tray at a pigeon that looked far too interested. The boy lingered. Out of chalk? Marcellus asked, eyes narrowing as he noticed the empty hand. The boy nodded. Marcellus tilted his head. I had some once. Used it to write measurements, but it all crumbled. He picked up a roll slightly lopsided and held it out. Here, for your trouble. The boy accepted it with both hands, nodded once, moved on. At Lucius's stall, the soap man was selling something he claimed smelled like ambition in a thunderstorm. Lucius raised a brow. You look like a man without a medium. The boy held up his empty pouch. Lucius whistled. Tragic. It's like watching a bird without feathers. He reached into his apron pocket, pulled out a crumb of blue wax. Want to try soap drawing? It's slippery, but smells better. The boy gave him a look. Lucius grinned. Didn't think so. Good luck. Chalksmith. Still no chalk. He walked the alleys he usually avoided, the ones with too many crates and too few windows, where the air was thick with old grease and steam. In a narrow lane behind the dye house, he found a girl about his age painting a wooden sign in long, careful strokes. She looked up. You're the wall kid. He nodded. Ran out. He shrugged. She studied him. Come back at dusk. My father lets me have the dried ends of his chalk paint sticks. Not perfect, but they leave a mark. He nodded again. Slower this time. Name's Mira, she said, offering a smile. He didn't say his, just returned the smile and walked away. At the chalk wall, he sat and waited, watched the world pass. Titus arguing with the goat, who seemed to have eaten a silk glove. Aurelia shaking out a rug from her window. Lucius playing tug-of-war with a customer over the last bar of rosemary sage soap. And he watched the wall remain blank. It felt wrong. Like a note not played, a breath held too long. As the sun tilted toward evening, Aurelia appeared beside him, arms folded in that gentle way of hers. No drawings today. He looked at her. Then the wall. She sat beside him, not too close. You know, before I stitched, I used to draw badly, but still. He tilted his head. My brother and I would use burnt sticks on our kitchen floor. Got in trouble every time. She smiled at the memory. Then she reached into her shawl and pulled out a wrapped bundle. Inside, 2 small sticks of white chalk, tied with blue thread. Found these in a sewing kit someone donated to me. Thought of you. He blinked, reached for them slowly, as if they might vanish. Aurelia touched his shoulder. Some people write with words. You write with space. He stood, turned to the wall, and began, not rushed, not scattered. 1 spiral, then 2, a goat, a scarf, a loaf of bread with steam curling from its top. Lucius appeared mid-drawing, clutching his ledger. You back in business, wall whisperer. The boy kept drawing, but nodded. Lucius leaned close. I knew you couldn't stay quiet. You've got things to say. Marcellus arrived, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted cloth. Looks like you drew my nose too big again. The boy smirked. added a pigeon on Marcellus's shoulder. Titus strolled up, goat in tow. The goat bleated. Better include her, too, Titus said. She's practically part of the family now. The boy did. The wall filled with laughter, with movement, with moments. When he finished, he stood back, added a final line across the bottom. Some days, you just need to be reminded of who's still here. They stood in silence, and as dusk settled over Aquilonia, the chalk shimmered faintly in the fading light. Someone laughed softly. A child clapped, and the boy felt something settle in his chest. Not fame, not pride, but place. He was part of the wall now, and the wall remembered. Marcellus and the recipe that was never written down. The recipe didn't exist. Not on paper, not in any cookbook, not even scratched on the flour-dusted back of a wine-stained receipt like some of Marcellus's other creations. It lived only in his hands, and maybe if you asked the right people, it lived in the steam that rose from his back counter every other Tuesday, when the scent of nutmeg, honey, and something impossibly warm drifted through Aquilonia, like a gentle reminder that the world still had secrets. He called it bread, but it wasn't really bread. Too sweet to be dinner, too savory to be dessert. Soft in the center, crisp at the corners, and somehow always exactly what people didn't know they needed. He only made it when the weather shifted. Like today, the clouds sat low over the rooftops. The breeze smelled like iron and moss. It wasn't quite rain, but the kind of air that reminded people of letters they hadn't written and faces they missed. Marcellus stood at his prep table, eyes narrowed. He cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, added a splash of honey, paused, then added another. He didn't measure. He remembered. Flour, asked Lucius, leaning in from the doorway. Maybe yeast. Tempting. Any idea what you're doing? Marcellus smirked. Never. Lucius dropped a small bundle on the table. Here, someone left this at my stall, said it was for the baker with the eyes that think too much. And that's you, I assume. Marcellus unwrapped it. Inside, dried figs, a pinch of saffron, and a note. You fed me when no one did. I thought you might use these better than I would. No signature, just a small spiral at the bottom corner. Marcellus held the figs up to the light. Soft, sweet, sun-kissed. He added them to the bowl. Lucius whistled. That's going to taste like regret and forgiveness. Perfect. He worked in silence after Lucius left. The dough came together sticky and fragrant, clinging to his fingers like memory. Outside, the street quieted. A drizzle began to tap on the window. Aurelia appeared a little after noon, holding a bundle of cloth. New apron, she said. Yours has more holes than fabric. He took it, tied it on. Thanks. You making the knot bread? Almost. She stayed, watched him knead, fold, rest, watch the rise begin, slow and steady. Why don't you ever write it down? She asked. Marcellus paused. Because I'm afraid it'll stop changing. She tilted her head. It's different every time, because I'm different every time. If I write it down, it'll become a rule, not a story. She nodded. I understand that as the oven warmed, the bakery filled with scent, people began drifting in not to buy. Not at first, but to linger. Titus brought the goat, who promptly curled up near the fire and snored. Lucius passed out cups of tea he claimed came from the mountains. The chalk boy sat cross-legged in the corner, sketching spirals in steam on the window. When the knot bread emerged, golden and humming with warmth, Marcellus didn't slice it. He tore it by hand, passed pieces without asking for coin. No one refused. Silence fell, the kind born from shared comfort. Chewing, nodding, smiling, Titus murmured. Tastes like something you forgot you remembered. Lucius raised his tea. To recipes too good for parchment. Aurelia leaned against the counter. To people who feed us without asking why. Marcellus just smiled. Later that evening, long after the last crumb had been swept and the fire had died to ember, he sat alone at the prep table. He reached for a scrap of paper, paused, picked up a piece of charcoal, then wrote 2 eggs, honey, twice, figs, only if they feel like home, fold with your whole self, bake until someone sighs. He left the paper under the window, for whoever might need it next. Titus and the rain that wasn't forecasted. Titus didn't trust forecasts. He said the sky had no obligation to inform anyone of its plans, especially not him, which is why, on the day the rain arrived unannounced, he stood in the square completely dry under a tarp, but surrounded by chaos. The clouds hadn't just rolled in, they had stampeded, dark, rumbling things that seemed offended by sunlight. And when the rain fell, it did so with the fury of a goat denied a snack. Within minutes, the market became a muddle of puddles, overturned baskets, and fleeing merchants. But Titus stayed. He was already soaked from the knees down thanks to a rogue cartwheel splash, and there was nowhere else to be. Besides, someone had to keep the goat company. Could have warned me, he muttered, glaring at the sky. The goat, now named Senator by popular acclaim, blinked slowly and continued chewing a soggy banner that had washed into their tent. Titus rubbed his temples. Lucius arrived next, hair slicked to his head, soap stool covered in a large oilcloth. Morning forecast called for mild drizzle, he said, wringing out his sleeves. Mild. My sandal, Titus grumbled. The gods are washing the cobblestones with intent. Lucius passed him a cloth. You're crankier than usual. I had a dream last night I owned 2 goats. Woke up sweating. Lucius laughed. Nightmares of prosperity. Aurelia soon joined them, her shawl pulled tight, eyes wide. I had laundry out, she said. This rain is personal. Marcellus ducked into the tent last, holding a basket covered in linen. The scent of fresh bread rose like a hymn. Thought someone might want a reason to forgive the weather. He handed each of them a roll still warm, steam curling from the crust. They ate in silence. The sound of rain softened. Or maybe they just stopped noticing. Aurelia turned to Titus. You always hear when it rains. Rain doesn't care where I go. Might as well stay put. Lucius smirked. That's almost poetic. Unintended, Titus muttered. From across the square, the chalk boy appeared hood up, shoes soaked. He carried something under his coat. When he reached them, he pulled out a board small, flat, covered in lines. It was a map of the market, drawn in charcoal and chalk, labelled with tiny spirals, arrows, and notes. Titus squinted. Is that us? The boy nodded. Aurelia traced her finger along the board. He marked the stalls, even the path the goat took last festival. Lucius tapped a corner. That's the wall. Marcellus leaned in. And this look. It's the bakery. You can see the oven here. The boy held up a piece of chalk. Then, on the back of the board, he drew 3 simple rain lines. Then a goat. Then Titus. Holding an umbrella, the tent erupted with laughter. Titus shook his head. You've doomed me to be the rain guy. Haven't you? The boy shrugged, smiled. From a nearby rooftop, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Light filtered through, golden and quiet. Lucius stood. I say we embrace it. Embrace what? Aurelia asked. The wet, the unexpected, the joy of bad timing. Marcellus nodded. Let's bake with damp flour. Let the crust surprise us. Titus sighed. You're all mad. And yet, Aurelia added, you're still here. The goat sneezed. Everyone jumped. The boy added that, too, to the drawing as the rain cleared, and the square returned to its messy, lovely rhythm. Titus stepped from under the tarp, shoes squelching. He looked up at the sky. I still don't trust you, he muttered. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind being surprised. Aurelia and the bell that didn't ring. The bell didn't ring. It was a small bell, really hardly more than a chime, hung delicately over the door of Aurelia's shop. It had been there since the day she moved in, gifted by the old woman who ran the button store before her. Every open door should sing, she'd said, and until that morning, it always had, even on stormy days, even when the hinges stuck, even when no one noticed but Aurelia herself. But today, silence. She pushed the door open again, slower this time, still no chime. Broken, asked Lucius, leaning into her doorway with a bar of soap shaped like a squirrel. I don't know, she said, furrowing her brow. It's just quiet. Lucius gave the bell a flick. It twitched, but no sound. Maybe it's shy, he offered. Maybe it's tired. Marcellus wandered in with a box of sweet buns. What's wrong with the bell? He asked, offering a bun without ceremony. She thinks it's broken. It is broken. Titus appeared next, holding a dripping umbrella. You ever think maybe it's not the bell? Maybe it's the silence around it? Everyone turned. What? Titus shrugged. Sometimes things don't sound the same when we're too loud to hear them. Aurelia walked to the door, stared up at the bell. Tiny, brass, etched with a spiral so faint you had to squint. She reached up, took it gently in hand. It felt warm. Lucius leaned back. We fixing a bell or writing poetry today? I'm not sure. Aurelia replied. She took it down, set it on her sewing table. Do bells wear out? She asked. Marcellus sat on the floor with a bun in one hand. Maybe they just need reminding. Of what? That someone's listening. They stared at it for a long moment. Then the chalk boy appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak, just looked at the bell, then at Aurelia. She lifted it. He stepped forward, pulled a small folded paper from his coat. Inside, a drawing of a spiral, circled by tiny lines like sound waves. In the center, a bell, ringing loud enough to make the page seem like it moved. Aurelia smiled. He pointed to her, then to the bell, then tapped his ear. Maybe it still rings. She whispered. We just forgot how to hear it. That afternoon, she polished the brass with soft cloth, retied the string with red thread, hung it carefully. Then, she waited. No wind, no door, just silence. Lucius returned near sundown, holding a bottle of something fortified. You talked to it yet? Aurelia chuckled. Not yet. He walked to the door. Then, gently, slowly, he opened it. Ding. The bell sang. Soft but clear. Everyone froze. Aurelia blinked. You heard that? Right. Lucius grinned. Never doubted it. Marcellus peeked in. Was that? Yep. Titus followed. Told you. Not broken. Just quiet. The chalk boy stood outside, beaming. Aurelia reached up, touched the bell. It rang again, this time louder, like it had taken a deep breath. That evening, they stayed late, lit candles, shared bread and stories. Every time the door opened, the bell chimed not for the sound, but for the memory that some things return when we slow down enough to let them. And as Aurelia closed the shop for the night, she whispered, Thank you, not to the bell, but to the silence, the soap that fell in love with the rain. Lucius never expected to fall in love, certainly not with a bar of soap, and definitely not during a rainstorm. But love like soap has a way of slipping into places you didn't plan for. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of grey, whispery morning that made the cobblestones sweat and the window panes sigh. Rain wasn't falling yet, but the sky had cleared its throat. Lucius was organising his display, arranging soaps by scent. Rosemary lavender, fig citrus, oat honey, each bar carefully carved, wrapped, tied with twine. He knew them all by shape, by texture, by name. He took pride in the craft, called them his silent children. And that day, one small bar stood out. It wasn't fancier or prettier, just different, a pale blue, smoothed more than carved. He didn't remember making it, but there it was. At the back of the crate, no label, no string, just the faint scent of sage and something else, like petrichor, the smell of dry earth greeting rain. He held it up, turned it in his palm, felt a strange warmth. Then the sky opened. The first drop landed on his forehead. He turned just as the breeze flipped the corner of his canvas awning and sent it fluttering. Rain, Titus called from across the square, diving under his cart's tarp like a man who had fought this battle before. Aurelia hurried by with her shawl pulled tight. Move it! Lucius, she yelled. You're going to drown in soap. But Lucius stayed. He watched the rain tumble from the edge of the awning in soft sheets, watched it bead on the table, soaking into the paper wrappings, watched as that pale blue bar slipped from his hand and landed squarely in a puddle. Ah, well, he muttered. Guess it's yours now. The bar floated for a second, spun slowly, then stopped. Lucius reached down, picked it up. It was warm, even wetter. It smelled stronger now, cleaner, fuller, like a story unwrapped. He held it close to his face, breathed it in. Marcellus, running by with a loaf under his coat, shouted, You all right, Lucius? I think this soap just told me a secret, Lucius replied. Marcellus didn't slow. Sounds about right. The rest of the day, Lucius kept the soap by his register. He didn't sell it, didn't wrap it, just let it sit there, in the open air, watching the world go by. That night, as he lit the lanterns in his stall, the rain softened to mist. The chalk boy stopped by. Lucius handed him the soap. Draw this, he said. The boy took it, turned it over, sniffed it, nodded, came back an hour later with a sketch, the bar floating in a puddle, surrounded by spirals and little arrows. In the center, a heart. Lucius grinned. You saw it too. Next day, Aurelia arrived with a new box of paper wraps. Ran out, she asked. Didn't want to hide it, he replied, nodding at the soap still sitting there. She picked it up. It's nice, feels honest. Lucius leaned on the counter. Honest soap. That's the name. Too simple. Then I'll call it Soap That Fell in Love with the Rain. She laughed. Now that's branding. The bar never did get sold. Lucius made copies, of course. Close imitations. Called them Rainheart, Downpour, First Storm. But the original stayed on the counter. It dried and cracked a little, faded at the edges. But every time it rained, Lucius set it by the window. And when asked, he'd say, some things don't clean you. They remind you you're already clean. One evening, long after the rains had stopped and the sky had turned the colour of wet slate, Titus stopped by. You still got that soggy love soap? Lucius nodded. Still here. Titus scratched his chin. We're all a bit like that bar. Huh. How so? Dropped in something unexpected. Changed by it. Still worth keeping around. Lucius raised his mug. To being soap, Titus grinned. To being soaked, the goat that knew when to sit still. In a city that never stopped talking, the goat was silent. And in a city that never stopped moving, the goat didn't budge. Her name was Senator, but she needed no title. She had become a fixture part of the street, like the fountain or the chipped statue of the wheat goddess that nobody prayed to anymore. This morning, the wind was busy, tugging at tunics, lifting laundry, scattering yesterday's leaves across cobblestone. Vendors were louder than usual. A tax collector had been spotted near the bathhouse, and panic rippled through the stalls like a spilled cup of wine. But Senator sat, legs tucked beneath her, chin lifted, scented. Titus was the first to notice. He was restacking bruised apples with the care of a man who refused to throw food out of spite. She's been there since sunrise, he said to Marcellus, who had arrived with a tray of cracked cinnamon biscuits. Is she sick? Marcellus asked. No. Titus said. She's watching. Lucius wandered up, sniffed the air, and winced. Something's off. It's the taxes, Aurelia muttered as she passed by. Arms full of linens. People get edgy when they see clipboards. The goat didn't flinch when a fruit cart toppled nearby. Didn't blink when a child dropped a tray of pebbles that scattered like marbles underfoot. When the mayor's nephew rode through on a borrowed donkey, shouting, "Make way for greatness," Senator merely turned her head, slowly, and then looked away. Lucius crouched beside her. What's your secret? The goat said nothing. He whispered. Do you know things? Ancient things. She sneezed. Bless you, said Aurelia, now returning with a jar of buttons and a basket of pins. The square filled quickly. People hustled past, clinging to sacks of grain and folded parchments. The usual rhythms of trade, gossip, and breadcrumbs inched forward. The chalk boy showed up mid-morning, dragging a string of weather-worn sketches. He paused beside the goat, studied her for a long moment, and began to draw. She's better than a guard, said Marcellus. I swear folks slow down when they see her. Titus poured a cup of tea and handed it to Lucius. She doesn't talk. She doesn't beg. She doesn't bolt when thunder cracks. Lucius sipped. She is serenity incarnate. Or a wizard, Aurelia added. One trapped in goat form, waiting for someone worthy. The goat blinked, possibly in agreement. Around noon, a travelling performer set up shop by the fountain. He juggled knives, danced on stilts, sang a ballad about lost sheep and misfired arrows. The goat watched for a moment, then turned her back to him. The performer bowed. Thank you, fair creature, for your indifference. Laughter bubbled around the stalls. Later, the tax collector finally entered the square. Dressed in faded red, tall hat cocked to one side, quill behind his ear. He looked official, smelled like vinegar. Everyone quieted. Even Lucius stopped mid-sail. The collector looked around, narrowed his eyes. Then, his foot caught the edge of Senator's blanket. He stumbled, not badly, but enough that the entire square inhaled at once. The goat raised her head slowly, deliberately. The collector froze. The goat didn't bleat, didn't move. She just stared. Long, intense, immovable. The collector straightened, adjusted his hat, took a slow step back, then cleared his throat and mumbled, "All appears in order." Before walking away at double pace, applause broke out. Light, nervous, delighted. Titus laughed. "She's our guardian." Aurelia bowed slightly. "Protector of stalls and sanctuary of peace." Lucius handed the goat a sliver of honey soap wrapped in mint. "For your service." She sniffed it, accepted. That evening, as lanterns were lit and shutters drawn, the goat remained, same spot, same posture. The chalk boy finished his drawing and propped it near her blanket. A perfect image, Senator in the center, eyes half-lidded, with chaos swirling in soft spirals around her. At the bottom, 3 words, "She simply is." Titus sat beside her, back resting on the crate, chewing a fig. "You make all of us better. You know that." She said nothing. He chuckled. "Right, of course you do." And the square grew still. Not silent, just still. Because some days, in a city that never stopped spinning, one goat sitting quietly reminded everyone how to pause, how to breathe, how to be. The letter sat in the bottom drawer beneath a bag of flour and a rusted tin of cinnamon. It had been there for 4 years, unsent, unfolded, unread. Marcellus opened the drawer that morning, not to find the letter, but to search for twine. A customer had asked for a bread parcel, and he preferred to wrap things properly. But instead, his fingers brushed paper, his breath caught. The paper was soft now, edges curled with time. The ink had faded just slightly enough that it seemed to whisper more than speak. He stood there, in the warm quiet of the bakery, surrounded by the smell of yeast and lemon peel, holding the weight of a moment that had never been shared. Lucius arrived a few minutes later, whistling a tune that didn't match the weather. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing the paper in Marcellus's hand. Marcellus blinked. "Just cleaning." Lucius wasn't fooled. He stepped closer. That a love letter or a confession? Marcellus smiled faintly. "Both." "Maybe neither." Aurelia walked in next, hands full of fabric scraps. "Your back door's open." "You know that." "Letting the breeze in," Marcellus replied. She saw the letter. "Ah, what is it with you people and he said. Lucius leaned on the counter. "It says more than questions." The goat wandered in, uninvited but welcome. Senator curled beside the oven as if she'd been summoned by old emotions and rising dough. Titus arrived, already chewing something. "You're all acting like someone died," he said. "No," Aurelia replied. "Just remembering." They sat, no orders, no bustle. Marcellus finally spoke. It was to my brother. Haven't seen him since the war ended. He moved north, said he needed sky and silence." "Did you argue?" asked Aurelia. Marcellus shook his head. "No, that was the problem. We didn't argue. We didn't talk." He left before I could say anything. Lucius glanced at the letter. "So why not send it now?" "It's out of date," Marcellus murmured. "It says things I don't feel anymore and things I still do." The chalk boy slipped in through the side door, holding a stick of charcoal. He knelt near the wall by the oven, one of the few spots in town not already marked, and began to draw. He sketched 2 loaves side by side, one cut, one whole, then, above them, a small envelope with a heart sealed in wax. Marcellus chuckled. "I'm being mocked by a 10-year-old. The boy gave a one-shoulder shrug and kept drawing. Titus leaned back. "You don't have to send the letter. Just write another." Marcellus looked up. "What would I even say?" Lucius answered. "You start with, 'I've been baking this whole time. Some days the bread is better. Some days it burns. But I kept baking.'" Aurelia added, "You tell him you kept the door open." The goat snorted. "That too," said Titus. "Include the goat." They all laughed. Then silence again. Marcellus looked down at the letter, folded it carefully, slipped it into his apron pocket. He didn't throw it away, didn't promise to send it. But later that night, when the oven had cooled and the square was washed in lamplight, he sat at his prep table with a clean sheet of paper. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He wrote, "Dear Leo, I don't know if this will reach you, but the bread still rises. The city still laughs. And somehow, I do too. I've missed you in the quiet spaces, in burnt crusts, in mornings that smell like cinnamon and memory. If you ever find your way back, there's a place at the table. The door creaks, but it opens." He signed it simply. Mal folded the paper, set it beside the old letter in the drawer, and smiled. Because sometimes, the words you never send still find their way back to you. The wall had no name, no plaki, no marker, just stone. Stone that had been there before the bakery, before the soap stall, before the girl with thread in her pocket and the boy with chalk on his fingertips. People passed it every day, learning, laughing, resting baskets against it. But some knew better. Some knew the wall listened. It began years ago, when the chalk boy first drew the silent symbols, a secret language only the observant could read. Back then, the drawings were simple: a loaf, a spiral, a single smiling goat. But as time passed, the wall filled with layers, stories in lines, history in smudges. That morning, the city awoke to a new message written low across the wall, barely above the ground. "This is where things return." Lucius noticed it first. He was sweeping soap crumbs and muttering about pigeons with no sense of manners. When the phrase caught his eye, he bent, squinted, and whispered, "Well, that's new." Soon, the others arrived. Marcellus, with flour still in his hair; Aurelia, carrying a basket of mended shawls; Titus, trailing Senator the goat and sipping tepid tea. The chalk boy stood nearby, fingers dusted with grey. "I didn't write it," he said softly. They turned to him. "But you could have," Aurelia replied. He nodded. "But I didn't." That gave them pause. They studied the wall. Drawings overlapped. A child's outline of a cart beside a detailed sketch of Lucius holding two soaps like scrolls. A stitched hem beside a loaf. A goat's face drawn at least 9 times. And beneath it all, layers upon layers of stories. Words that had faded. Names half smeared by time. Lucius ran a hand over the stone. "We should clean it." "No," said Marcellus. "Not yet." Aurelia traced a fingertip across an old drawing of her shawl. "It's a record. It's a memory," said Titus. Senator snorted. "Agreed. Most likely." That afternoon, a stranger appeared, older, weathered, a walking stick in one hand and a travel pack on his back. He paused at the wall, tilted his head, and stared. The others watched from their stalls. He stepped forward, ran his fingers gently across a faded line near the bottom, then turned. "Who drew this one?" he asked, pointing to a spiral next to a loaf. Marcellus squinted. "That's mine, I think." The man smiled. "I remember it. From before I left." Lucius stepped closer. "You from here?" The man nodded. "Long time ago. This wall," he tapped it, "held my goodbye once." Aurelia's voice was soft. "Did it keep it for you?" He smiled. "I think so." The chalk boy approached, handed the man a stick of fresh chalk. The man took it, crouched slowly, and wrote beneath the morning's message, "I came back." The door was still open. No one spoke. Marcellus finally asked, "What was your name?" The man stood, looked around at the circle of familiar strangers. "My brother used to call me Leo." Marcellus blinked, then stepped forward. They didn't hug, not right away, but their eyes did. 1,000 unspoken things passed in a single breath, and somewhere in the pause, the goat sat down. Later, Lucius lit a lantern and hung it beside the wall. Aurelia added a stitched spiral along the frame. Titus set down a cup of tea, and the chalk boy drew a final line curved, gentle, wrapping around all the others. That night, no one left early. They sat together in the hush, surrounded by flickering light and soft laughter. And the wall, as always, listened, because some stories don't need telling. They just need a place to live. Let this story be a soft place to rest tonight. If it brought a smile, share it with someone who's forgotten their own. Tell me where your story begins right down in the comments. Together, let's keep these quiet things alive.